They started out as simple money changers in the squares of Florence, but became the most influential dynasty in Europe. The Medici controlled the continent's finances, elevated their sons to the papal throne, and bought power with hard cash. Their bank became the first international corporation in history, and the sale of indulgences brought them fabulous wealth and power over the souls of millions of people. 4 popes, dozens of cardinals, queens, and dukes. All were the fruits of one family strategy. But how did simple bankers manage to buy divine power? And what price did humanity pay for their ambitions? Today we will reveal the secrets of the dynasty that changed the course of European history. If you are interested in the history of the Medici dynasty and the mechanisms of power in medieval Europe, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. In the comments, we will discuss a controversial question. Can the Medici popes' trade in indulgences be considered one of the main causes of the Protestant Reformation? Or was it just one of many factors in the religious schism? Share your opinion. In the 13th century, Florence was a boiling cauldron of commercial ambition and political intrigue. Among the narrow streets of this Italian city-state, a dynasty was emerging that was destined to change the course of European history. The Medici family appeared on the historical stage as ordinary money changers and wool merchants, but their ambitions extended far beyond the markets of Florence. The first mentions of the Medici date back to the 12th century, when they were engaged in currency exchange in the square in front of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. At that time, their family coat of arms was not yet adorned with the famous 6 balls, symbolizing coins or apothecary pills. According to one version, the family name comes from the word medico, doctor, which indicates their possible origin from a family of physicians. But the Medici's real rise began when they realized the true power of money in the medieval world. At a time when the Catholic Church prohibited usury under threat of excommunication, the family found ways to circumvent these restrictions. They developed complex financial schemes disguised as commercial transactions that allowed them to earn interest without formally violating church canons. The 13th century was a time when Florence was becoming one of the largest financial centers in Europe. Florins, the city's gold coins, became an international currency, and Florentine bankers financed kings and popes. It was in this atmosphere that the foundations of the Medici's future power were laid. Salvestro de' Medici, one of the first known members of the family, already played a significant role in the political life of the city in the 14th century. He was the gonfaloniere of justice, the highest office in the Florentine Republic. But his actions led to a popular uprising known as the Ciompi Revolt, after which the family temporarily lost its influence. However, the Medici would not have been the Medici if they had retreated after their first failure. They patiently waited for their moment, accumulating experience, connections, and, most importantly, capital. It was during this period that the principles that would later make them the most influential family in Europe were formed. Caution in politics, generosity to allies, and ruthlessness to enemies. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici was born in 1360 and became the true founder of the family's banking empire. This man possessed a rare combination of business acumen and political wisdom, which allowed him to lay the foundation for the future power of the dynasty. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Giovanni understood that true power comes not through open confrontation, but through the skillful use of financial influence. In 1397, Giovanni founded the Medici Bank, which revolutionized the world of medieval finance. His main innovation was a system of branches scattered throughout Europe. Branches of the bank opened in Rome, Venice, Naples, Milan, Pisa, Geneva, Lyon, Bruges, and London. Each branch operated as an independent partnership, which minimized risk and maximized profit. Giovanni paid particular attention to relations with the papal court. At that time, the Catholic Church was not only a spiritual, but also the largest economic institution in Europe. Papal finances required professional management, and the Medici Bank became the main financial agent of the Holy See. They collected church taxes from all over Europe, managed papal revenues, and financed church projects. This connection with the church brought the Medici not only huge profits, but also moral dilemmas. The Catholic Church officially prohibited usury, considering it a sin. However, the Medici bankers found sophisticated ways to circumvent these restrictions. They developed a system of hidden interest rates disguised as currency transactions and trading commissions. Giovanni proved himself not only as a talented financier, but also as a far-sighted politician. He understood that wealth without political influence was fragile and vulnerable. Therefore, he began to actively support various political factions in Florence, always remaining in the shadows, but controlling the situation through financial levers. One of his most brilliant decisions was to finance the election of Cardinal Balthasar Cossa to the papal throne under the name of John XXIII. Although this pontiff was later deposed at the Council of Constance, his reign brought the Medici Bank enormous profits and strengthened the family's position in the church hierarchy. By the time of Giovanni's death in 1429, the Medici Bank had become the largest financial institution in Europe. Its capital was estimated at 180,000 florins, an astronomical sum for those times. But the most important legacy he left to his descendants was not money, but principles of doing business and understanding the mechanisms of power. Cosimo de' Medici, who later earned the nickname the Elder, inherited from his father not only a huge fortune, but also a deep understanding of the mechanisms of power. Born in 1389, he was immersed in the world of high politics and international finance from childhood. When he took over the family bank in 1429, he was only 40 years old, but he already had a wealth of experience in the most complex financial transactions in Europe. Cosimo understood that in order to preserve and increase the family's wealth, it was necessary not only to successfully conduct banking affairs, but also to actively influence political processes. At that time, Florence was ruled by an oligarchy of the wealthiest families, but power constantly changed hands as a result of intrigues and conspiracies. The Medici needed to find a way to consolidate their power for the long term. The first serious test came in 1433, when the Medici's opponents, led by the Albizzi family, organized a political trial against Cosimo. He was accused of tyranny and sentenced to exile from Florence. But even while in exile in Venice, Cosimo continued to manage his financial empire and weave a network of political alliances. The exile lasted only a year. In 1434, Cosimo made a triumphant return to Florence, relying on the support of the very people to whom his bank had provided loans. This return was a turning point in the history of not only the Medici family, but of Florence as a whole. Cosimo realized that political power was not a luxury, but a necessity for protecting financial interests. After his return, Cosimo effectively became the informal ruler of the Florentine Republic. Formally, republican institutions continued to function, but all important decisions were made in the Medici Palace on Via Larga. Cosimo created an extensive network of supporters, whom his contemporaries called the Medici Party. It included not only bankers and merchants, but also artisans, who received orders and loans from the Medici. Cosimo paid special attention to culture and art, understanding their importance in creating a positive image for the family. He patronized humanists, financed the construction of churches and palaces, and collected ancient manuscripts. His library became one of the largest in Europe. Cosimo commissioned works of art from the best masters of his time, including Donatello and Filippo Brunelleschi. But Cosimo's main achievement was turning the Medici Bank into an international financial corporation. Under him, the bank began to lend not only to Italian rulers, but also to the kings of England and France. Edward IV of England owed the Medici Bank more than £100,000, a colossal sum for that time. The Medici's banking innovations in the 15th century were so revolutionary that they laid the foundations for the modern financial system. The family did not simply engage in usury. They created a complex international network that, for the first time in history, linked the finances of all of Europe together. Their methods were centuries ahead of their time and became a model for future generations of bankers. The Medici system was based on a decentralized branch structure. Each branch of the bank was an independent partnership with local managers who shared in the profits and were responsible for the losses. This allowed them to quickly adapt to local conditions and minimize risks. If one branch failed, it did not threaten the entire system. A particularly important innovation was the double-entry bookkeeping system. Each transaction was recorded twice, as income and as an expense, which made it possible to control the movement of funds and identify errors. This system, developed at the Medici Bank, subsequently became the standard for the entire financial world. The Medici also developed sophisticated international payment instruments. They created a system of transferable bills of exchange that allowed merchants to transport money without the risk of robbery. A merchant could deposit money at a bank branch in one city and receive it in another, paying a commission. This revolutionized international trade and made the Medici Bank indispensable to merchants throughout Europe. In London, the Medici Bank branch became the largest importer of English wool and a creditor to the English crown. The London branch was managed by Girozzo de Pazzi, one of the most talented bankers of his time. He not only conducted wool transactions, but also financed English military campaigns during the War of the Roses. In Florence, the bank controlled a significant part of the textile industry. The Medici owned factories producing wool and silk fabrics, which were exported throughout Europe. They also traded in spices brought from the East through Venetian intermediaries. This diversification of activities made the bank less dependent on purely financial operations. The Medici Bank's branch in Rome was particularly important, as it managed the finances of the papal court. Medici bankers collected church taxes from all over Europe, managed the income from the sale of church offices, and organized the financing of the Crusades. This connection with the church brought not only huge profits, but also political influence. The Medici's innovations were not limited to purely technical aspects of banking. They also developed new principles of risk management and capital diversification. The family never invested all their funds in a single transaction or a single country, which allowed them to survive political crises and economic upheavals. Lorenzo de' Medici, who went down in history as the Magnificent, embodied all the ambitions and talents of his dynasty. Born in 1449, he received a brilliant education and was immersed in the world of high politics and high culture from a young age. When Lorenzo became head of the family in 1469 after the death of his father Piero, he was only 20 years old, but he already possessed a political wisdom that amazed his contemporaries. Lorenzo's reign marked the height of the Medici's power and the golden age of the Florentine Renaissance. He managed to combine the roles of banker, politician, diplomat, poet, and patron of the arts. His contemporaries called him the father of the fatherland and saw in him the embodiment of the ideal philosopher-ruler described by ancient thinkers. Lorenzo's political artistry reached its peak during the so-called Papacy War, a conflict with Pope Sixtus IV, who sought to weaken the Medici's influence in central Italy. The Pope supported the Papacy family, the Medici's banking rivals, and even blessed a conspiracy against the brothers Lorenzo and Giuliano. The Papacy conspiracy became one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the Renaissance. On Sunday, April 26, 1478, during Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the conspirators attacked the Medici brothers. Giuliano was killed on the spot, receiving 19 wounds, but Lorenzo managed to escape by hiding in the sacristy. News of the assassination attempt spread instantly throughout the city, and the people rose to defend the Medici. The conspirators were captured and executed, and their bodies were hung on the walls of the Palazzo della Signoria. After the failed assassination attempt, Lorenzo proved himself to be an outstanding diplomat. Realizing that Florence could not withstand the combined forces of the Pope and the King of Naples, he made a risky decision. In December 1479, Lorenzo personally traveled to Naples to negotiate with King Ferrante, despite the risk of being arrested or killed. This diplomatic mission was a triumph for Lorenzo. With his charm and political wisdom, he managed to persuade the Neapolitan king and conclude a peace treaty that not only preserved Florence's independence, but also strengthened the Medici's position. Pope Sixtus IV was forced to admit defeat and reconcile with Lorenzo. But Lorenzo's true greatness was evident not only in politics, but also in his role as a patron of the arts and sciences. He turned Florence into the cultural capital of Europe, attracting the best artists, poets, philosophers, and scientists. Sandro Botticelli, Andrea Verrocchio, the young Michelangelo, Angelo Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola, and many other Renaissance geniuses worked under his patronage. Lorenzo himself was a talented poet and wrote poems in the Tuscan dialect, contributing to the formation of the Italian literary language. His works, including the famous Carnival songs, became classics of Italian poetry. He also assembled one of the largest libraries in Europe, which included unique Greek and Latin manuscripts. The political intrigues surrounding the Medici family in the 15th century resembled a complex chess game, where the stakes were not only wealth, but also the very lives of the players. The power of the banking dynasty aroused envy and fear among many influential families in Europe, which inevitably led to conspiracies and attempts to eliminate competitors. The history of the Medici family during this period is a chronicle of a constant struggle for survival in a world where politics and business were inextricably linked. One of the Medici's most serious opponents was the Papacy family, Florentine bankers who sought to oust their competitors and seize their market share. The Papacy had ancient roots and prided themselves on their aristocratic origins, unlike the Medici, whom they considered upstarts. The conflict between the two families began as a business rivalry, but gradually escalated into a deadly feud. Francesco Papacy, the head of the family, established close ties with Pope Sixtus IV, who also saw the rise of the Medici as a threat to papal power in central Italy. The pontiff sought to expand the territories of the Papal States, and feared that Florence under Medici rule would become too independent. The Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, an ambitious prelate who hoped to obtain the Florentine archbishopric, also joined the conspiracy. The conspirators' plans were carefully thought out. They decided to kill both Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano, during a solemn mass in Florence's main cathedral, when they would be most vulnerable and unable to count on the protection of their supporters. The assassins were to be hired killers from among the discontented Florentine nobles and professional soldiers from the Archbishop's army. On April 26, 1478, on Holy Sunday, the conspirators carried out their plan. The moment for the attack was chosen with cynical precision during the consecration of the gifts, when all those present were kneeling. The signal for the start of the assassination was the ringing of a bell when the holy gifts were raised. Giuliano de' Medici was the first to fall. The conspirators stabbed him 19 times, displaying a cruelty that shocked even the Florentines, who were accustomed to violence. Lorenzo was slightly wounded in the neck, but managed to grab a sword and make his way to the sacristy, where his friends barricaded the doors and gave him first aid. However, the conspirators underestimated the reaction of the Florentine people. Instead of the expected uprising against Medici tyranny, the city erupted in anger against the murderers. Crowds of Florentines took to the streets shouting, "Palle! Palle!" the battle cry of Medici supporters, named after the balls on their coat of arms. Archbishop Salviati was captured in the Palazzo della Signoria and hanged from a window along with the other conspirators. Francesco Pazzi tried to hide in his palace, but was found and also executed. His naked body was dragged through the streets of Florence and hung next to the archbishop. In total, more than 70 people suspected of participating in the conspiracy were killed that day. The artist Andrea del Castagno even painted portraits of the executed conspirators on the wall of the city prison. The story of Giovanni de' Medici's rise to the papal throne under the name Leo X became the embodiment of the family's centuries-old ambitions and proof that money really can buy even divine power. Born in 1475, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent was prepared for a career in the church from childhood, which was part of the family's strategic plan to penetrate the upper echelons of the Catholic hierarchy. Giovanni's ecclesiastical career began surprisingly early, even by the standards of the time. At the age of 7, he received the tonsure and became a cleric. At 13, he was appointed abbot of the wealthy monastery of Monte Cassino. And at 14, he received a cardinal's hat from Pope Innocent VIII. This appointment was the result of skillful negotiations by Lorenzo the Magnificent, who used all his influence and considerable financial resources to promote his son. The young cardinal's education matched his family's ambitions. Giovanni studied theology and canon law at the universities of Pisa and Florence, received a brilliant humanistic education, and spoke several languages. But his main university was his daily practice at the Medici Bank, where from a young age he observed the mechanisms of international politics and financial operations. After his father's death in 1492, Giovanni became one of the most influential cardinals in Europe, despite his young age. He was actively involved in church politics, supported various papal campaigns, and gradually formed a coalition of supporters that could secure his election to the papal throne. The conclave of 1513, at which the successor to Pope Julius II was elected, was a triumph for Medici family diplomacy. Giovanni managed to unite cardinals of various nationalities and political orientations around his candidacy. Not only his personal qualities, but also the financial capabilities of his family played a decisive role. The Medici family spared no expense on gifts and promises, which tipped the scales in favor of their candidate. The election of the 37-year-old Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo V was a sensation throughout Europe. He was one of the youngest pontiffs in the history of the Catholic Church, and the first representative of a banking dynasty to attain the highest spiritual authority. The coronation of the new pope turned into a grand celebration, on which enormous sums of money were spent. Leo X's reign radically changed the appearance of the papal court. The new pontiff brought the spirit of the Florentine Renaissance to the Vatican, turning the papal court into a center of arts and sciences. He patronized Raphael, Michelangelo, Bramante, and other great masters of the era. Under his patronage, construction began on the new St. Peter's Basilica, which became a symbol of the power of the Catholic Church. However, Leo X's papacy was also a time of serious problems for the Catholic Church. His extravagance and trade in indulgences drew sharp criticism from reformers, including Martin Luther. Luther's famous 95 Theses were directed primarily against the practice of selling indulgences, which reached unprecedented proportions under Leo X. Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici, was the second pope from the banking family, and perhaps the most tragic of all the Medici pontiffs. His pontificate coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in European history, when the Church was shaken by Reformation movements and Italy was torn apart by wars between the great powers. The fate of Clement VII became a vivid illustration of how even unlimited power and enormous wealth cannot withstand the forces of historical change. Giulio was the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici, who was killed during the Pazzi conspiracy. But this did not prevent him from having a brilliant ecclesiastical career thanks to the support of his cousin, Leo X. After Giovanni de' Medici was elected pope, Giulio became his closest advisor and the de facto ruler of the Papal States. He received a cardinal's hat and numerous lucrative ecclesiastical benefices, making him one of the richest prelates in Europe. The conclave of 1523, which elected Clement VII, took place in an extremely difficult political situation. Europe was divided by the conflict between Emperor Charles V and French King Francis I. Italy became a battlefield between these monarchs, and the new pope had to maneuver between two powerful rivals without having sufficient strength for an independent policy. Clement VII attempted to pursue a policy of balance, supporting first the emperor and then the French king. But this diplomatic game proved fatal for him. In 1527, the troops of Charles V, consisting of German mercenaries and Spanish soldiers, approached Rome. Many of these mercenaries were Protestants and were eager to plunder the capital of the Catholic world. On May 6, 1527, one of the most terrible episodes in the history of Rome began: its plunder by the imperial troops. Pope Clement VII was forced to take refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, from where he watched in horror as soldiers looted churches, killed priests, and raped nuns. The city was left to be plundered for 8 days, and the damage was enormous. The Pope's capture was a humiliation not only for the Catholic Church, but also for the entire Medici family. Clement VII spent 7 months in captivity in the Castel Sant'Angelo, after which he was forced to pay a huge ransom for his freedom. The conditions of his release included renouncing his anti-imperial policy and agreeing to convene a council to carry out church reform. After his release, Clement VII attempted to restore the authority of the papacy, but faced new challenges. In England, King Henry VIII demanded permission to divorce Catherine of Aragon, the aunt of Emperor Charles V. The Pope found himself between a rock and a hard place. Refusing the king threatened a schism with the English Church, while agreeing threatened conflict with the emperor. Clement VII chose the path of procrastination and diplomatic maneuvers, but ultimately lost both. Henry VIII declared himself head of the English Church, while the emperor continued to dictate his will to the Pope. The pontificate of Clement VII became a symbol of the decline of papal power and the loss of political independence of the Holy See. The trade in indulgences under the Medici popes reached such proportions that the remission of sins became a veritable industry. This practice, which originally arose as a way to raise funds for pious purposes, turned into a complex financial system in the hands of the banker pontiffs, which brought the Catholic Church enormous revenues, but at the same time became one of the main causes of the Reformation. According to Catholic doctrine, an indulgence was the remission of temporary punishment for sins already forgiven in the sacrament of penance. The theological justification for this practice was based on the doctrine of the treasury of merits, the spiritual capital accumulated by Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, which the Church could dispose of for the benefit of the faithful. However, under the Medici popes, this spiritual concept took on a distinctly commercial character. Leo X turned the sale of indulgences into the main source of income for financing the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope appointed special commissioners for the sale of indulgences, who traveled throughout Europe with the authority to forgive any sins in exchange for monetary donations. The prices of indulgences varied depending on the social status of the buyer and the severity of the sin. Particularly cynical was the practice of selling indulgences for souls in purgatory. Dominican monk Johann Tetzel, one of Leo X's chief agents in Germany, developed a veritable marketing campaign with a memorable slogan: "As soon as the coin clinks in the box, the soul flies from purgatory to paradise." This formula turned the EBE, salvation of the soul, into a simple commercial transaction. The system of selling indulgences was carefully organized and resembled a modern corporate structure. Papal legates received exclusive rights to trade indulgences in certain regions, with a significant portion of the proceeds going to Rome and local intermediaries receiving their share of the commission. The Medici Bank played a key role in this system, providing money transfers and currency transactions. Albert of Brandenburg, Archbishop of Mainz, became one of the largest clients of this system. In order to obtain several archbishoprics at once, which was formally prohibited by canon law, he paid the Pope a huge sum, 34,000 ducats. To cover this debt, Albert received the right to trade indulgences in his lands, with half of the proceeds going to Rome. Papal instructions to commissioners on the sale of indulgences contained detailed guidelines on how to maximize revenues. It was recommended to use emotional appeal, telling of the sufferings of souls in purgatory and the possibility of their release for a small fee. Particular attention was paid to working with wealthy buyers, who were offered individual indulgence packages. Clement VII continued and expanded this practice despite growing criticism. Under him, new types of indulgences appeared: for participation in the Crusades against the Turks, for donations to the fight against heretics, and for the construction of churches. Each military campaign or construction project was accompanied by special indulgences, the prices of which were set according to the needs of the papal treasury. Pius IV, born Gian Angelo de' Medici, became the third pope from the family of Florentine bankers. But his ascension to the throne of St. Peter took place in completely different historical circumstances. By the middle of the 16th century, the Catholic Church was in a state of deep crisis caused by the Protestant Reformation and was in need of radical reforms. The election of Pius IV in 1559 was an attempt to restore the authority of the papacy and carry out internal reform of the Church. Gian Angelo belonged to a younger branch of the Medici family, which had no direct connection to the banking empire of his Florentine cousins, but bore the same famous name. He was born in 1499 in Milan to a notary and received a legal education at the University of Bologna. His career began not in banking, but in the papal curia, where he proved himself to be a talented administrator and expert in canon law. Gian Angelo's rise to the papal throne was the result of complex political calculations by the College of Cardinals. After the death of Paul IV, a pope from the Neapolitan Carafa family, the cardinals sought a candidate who could reconcile the various factions in the church hierarchy and continue the reforms of the Council of Trent. The Medici name still had magical power, associated with wealth and political influence. The conclave of 1559 took place in a tense atmosphere. The cardinals divided into several groups depending on their political sympathies and views on church reform. The French cardinals supported one candidate, the Spanish cardinals supported another, and the Italian cardinals were divided between various regional interests. Gian Angelo de' Medici turned out to be a compromise figure acceptable to the majority. The election of Pius IV came as a surprise even to himself. Unlike his famous predecessors, he did not seek the papal throne and did not actively campaign. His candidacy was the result of political bargaining between various factions of cardinals, each of which saw in him an opportunity to advance its interests. Pius IV's reign coincided with the final stage of the Council of Trent, which was supposed to develop the Catholic Church's response to the challenges of Protestantism. The new pope proved himself to be a decisive reformer who supported the need for change in church life. He approved the decrees of the council concerning the reform of the clergy, the improvement of priestly education, and the fight against abuse. One of the most important achievements of Pius IV's pontificate was the publication of the new Roman Catechism, which became the basis of Catholic doctrine for several centuries to come. This document systematized Catholic doctrine and provided priests with clear guidelines for preaching and teaching the faithful. The Catechism was a response to Protestant criticism of Catholic teaching. Pius IV also carried out important administrative reforms in the papal curia. He restricted the sale of church offices, improved the system for appointing bishops, and introduced stricter requirements for candidates for priesthood. These measures were aimed at enhancing the moral authority of the clergy and restoring the faithful's trust in the Church. Unlike his predecessors from the Medici family, Pius IV was not known for his extravagance and luxurious lifestyle. He focused on the spiritual aspects of the papal ministry and avoided the political intrigues that characterized the pontificates of Leo X and Clement VII. His reign lasted 5 years and ended in 1565. Leo XI, the last pope from the Medici family, ruled the Catholic Church for only 27 days. But even this brief period was enough to demonstrate how much the role of the family in European politics had changed by the beginning of the 17th century. Alessandro Ottaviano de' Medici, elected pope in April 1505, became a symbol of the decline of the once powerful dynasty and a witness to the transformation of papal power into a new era. Alessandro was born in Florence in 1535 into the family of Ottaviano de' Medici. a representative of a side branch of the famous family. By this time, the main line of the Medici had already lost control of its banking empire, and the family's political influence had significantly weakened. Florence was under the rule of the Grand Dukes of the Medici dynasty, but this was a completely different branch of the family, far removed from the banking traditions of its founders. Alessandro's ecclesiastical career began thanks to the patronage of his cousin, Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, who later became Grand Duke of Tuscany. Family ties continued to play an important role in advancement through the church hierarchy, and the Medici name opened many doors. Alessandro received his cardinal's hat from Pope Sixtus V in 1583, when he was only 48 years old. The conclave of 1605, which elected Leo XI, took place amid intense political confrontation between the Catholic powers of Europe. Spain and France were vying for influence over papal policy, while the Italian princes sought to use ecclesiastical power to resolve their territorial disputes. Cardinal Alessandro de' Medici seemed to be a compromise figure capable of reconciling the opposing sides. The election went smoothly, which was rare for papal conclaves of that time. The cardinals unanimously supported Alessandro's candidacy, seeing him as an experienced administrator and diplomat. The new pope took the name Leo XI in honor of his famous ancestor, Leo X, hoping to revive the glorious traditions of his family on the papal throne. However, Leo XI's reign turned out to be tragically short. Just 3 weeks after his coronation, the Pope fell ill, and a few days later he died under mysterious circumstances. Many of his contemporaries suspected poisoning, which was a fairly common explanation for the sudden deaths of high-ranking officials at that time. The official cause of death was declared to be fever, but rumors of a conspiracy continued to circulate in Roman salons. During his 27 days as pontiff, Leo XI did not have time to carry out significant reforms or make important decisions. His main achievement was the appointment of several cardinals, including representatives of noble Italian families. These appointments reflected the Medici's traditional approach of using ecclesiastical power to strengthen political alliances and family ties. The death of Leo XI marked the end of the Medici papacy and the symbolic end of the family's golden age. After him, no other member of the family ever occupied the papal throne, although individual family members continued to play important roles in the church hierarchy. The brevity of his reign became a metaphor for the waning influence of a dynasty that once controlled the finances of Europe and dictated its will to kings and emperors. The funeral of Leo XI turned into a lavish ceremony attended by representatives of all the influential families of Europe. But behind the solemn rituals lay the understanding that the Medici era was coming to an end, and that new forces were replacing the banking dynasties, absolutist monarchies, and nascent nation-states. Maria de' Medici, who became Queen of France, embodied the family's new strategy for maintaining influence in a changed world. When the Medici banking empire declined and the papal throne no longer guaranteed political power, the dynasty turned to matrimonial diplomacy, using marriages to penetrate the ruling houses of Europe. Maria's fate became a striking example of how women from the Medici family became conduits of their family's influence in the new political realities. Maria was born in Florence in 1575, when the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was at the height of its prosperity under the rule of Francesco I de' Medici. She was the daughter of Grand Duke Francesco and Joanna of Austria, which made her one of the most eligible brides in Europe. From childhood, Maria received an excellent education, studying languages, arts, and politics, preparing for the role she was to play on the European stage. Maria's marriage to King Henry IV of France was the result of complex diplomatic negotiations in which money played a decisive role. France was in a difficult financial situation after the religious wars, and Maria's dowry of 600,000 écus was an important factor in the decision to marry. The Medici family continued to use their wealth as a tool of political influence. The wedding ceremony, which took place in Florence in 1500 by proxy and was then repeated in Lyon, was a grand political spectacle. Maria arrived in France accompanied by a brilliant entourage that included artists, musicians, and Italian courtiers. Her arrival marked the beginning of a new phase of Italian cultural influence on the French court. Maria's position as Queen of France was difficult from the outset. Henry IV married her solely for political reasons, continuing his love affairs with his mistresses. Mary had to not only perform representative functions, but also give birth to heirs to ensure dynastic succession. She bore the king 6 children, including the future Louis XIII. The assassination of Henry IV in 1610 radically changed Marie's position. She became regent for her young son Louis XIII and effectively ruled France for 7 years. This was a period when Marie was able to fully demonstrate the political talents she had inherited from her banker ancestors. She pursued a cautious policy, seeking to maintain peace with neighboring powers and strengthen the internal position of the dynasty. Marie's regency was marked by significant cultural achievements. She commissioned Peter Paul Rubens to paint a famous series of paintings dedicated to her life, which adorned the Luxembourg Palace. These canvases became one of the greatest works of Baroque art and immortalized the image of the Medici queen in European culture. Maria also patronized architecture, commissioning the construction and renovation of royal residences. Maria's policies did not always find support among the French nobility. Many aristocrats considered her too soft in her relations with Spain and the Catholic League. The opposition accused the Queen Mother of putting the interests of Italy above those of France. These accusations led to a series of conflicts known as the princely revolts, when representatives of the highest nobility opposed Marie. When Louis XIII came of age, relations between mother and son became strained. The young king sought independence and did not always share Marie's political views. The conflict reached its peak when Louis effectively removed his mother from power, relying on the support of Cardinal Richelieu. Marie was forced to leave the French court and spend the last years of her life in exile. The decline of the Medici banking empire became one of the most dramatic stories in European economic history. The financial system that had controlled the continent's cash flows for more than 200 years gradually collapsed under the influence of political upheavals, changes in trade routes, and its own strategic mistakes. By the end of the 15th century, the once powerful Medici banking network was in a state of deep crisis. The first serious problems began under Lorenzo the Magnificent, who, preoccupied with politics and patronage of the arts, paid insufficient attention to banking operations. The costs of maintaining a luxurious court, financing political allies, and commissioning works of art exceeded the income of even such a wealthy family. Lorenzo was forced to use the funds of his wards and the public funds of Florence to cover his personal expenses. The closure of the bank's London branch in 1478 was a particularly painful blow. English King Edward IV refused to repay a huge debt of £150,000, which led to the bankruptcy of one of the most profitable branches of the banking network. The loss of the London branch was the beginning of a chain reaction that led to the closure of other foreign offices. Political instability in Italy at the end of the 15th century exacerbated the Medici's financial problems. The Italian Wars, which began in 1494, turned the peninsula into a battlefield between France and Spain. Florence was repeatedly besieged and occupied, making it impossible to conduct normal banking operations. Customers lost confidence in the bank, unsure of its ability to preserve their funds. The expulsion of the Medici from Florence in 1494, after the fall of Lorenzo's regime, was a disaster for the family business. The Republican government confiscated many of the family's assets, and the remaining branches of the bank lost their central coordination. Without unified leadership, the banking network began to break down into independent parts, each acting on its own discretion. The Medicis returned to power in Florence in 1512 with the help of Spanish troops, failed to restore the former greatness of the banking empire. Giuliano and Lorenzo de' Medici, sons of Lorenzo the Magnificent, were more interested in politics and military campaigns than in restoring the family business. By this time, the financial center of Europe had already moved to other cities. The election of Giovanni de' Medici as Pope Leo X brought political prestige to the family, but failed to revive the banking empire. Papal finances were already managed by other bankers, mainly the German Fuggers, who were able to offer more reliable and favorable terms. The Medici went from being the Pope's creditors to his clients, symbolizing a complete reversal of roles. The last major banking venture of the Medici was an attempt by Cosimo I, who became Grand Duke of Tuscany, to establish a new bank in the mid-16th century. But this venture failed to achieve the scale of the medieval empire of his ancestors. Economic conditions had changed radically. The discovery of America had altered trade routes, and the creation of centralized monarchies had limited the opportunities for private bankers. The symbolic end of the Medici banking era came with the closure of the last branches of the family bank in the early 17th century. The Grand Dukes of Tuscany focused on governing the state, transforming themselves from international financiers into regional rulers. The era of the Medici bankers had ended, but a new chapter in the family's history as a ruling dynasty had begun. The last representatives of the Medici dynasty ruled the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the 18th century, when their once powerful family became one of many European ruling dynasties. The Grand Dukes of the House of Medici no longer controlled the continent's finances or elevated popes to the throne of Saint Peter, but they still retained political influence and vast art collections that became symbols of the family's former greatness. Cosimo III de' Medici, who ruled from 1670 to 1723, was one of the last prominent members of the dynasty. Under his rule, Florence experienced a cultural renaissance, although not as brilliant as in the days of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Cosimo III patronized the arts, science, and education, turning his court into a center of attraction for scholars and artists from all over Europe. Of particular note is the support that Cosimo III gave to Galileo Galilei in his later years. Despite the great scientist's condemnation by the Inquisition, the Grand Duke continued to defend Galileo and even offered him refuge in Florence. This position reflected the traditional policy of the Medici family to support innovators and free thinkers, even when it contradicted the official church line. Under Cosimo III, the famous Uffizi Museum was created in its modern form. The Grand Duke systematized the family's art collections, accumulated over several centuries, and opened them to the public. The Uffizi Gallery became one of the first publicly accessible museums in the world, and remains an important cultural legacy of the Medici dynasty. However, the political influence of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany steadily declined. With the formation of centralized nation-states, the small Italian principalities lost their independence. The wars of the Spanish succession in the early 18th century demonstrated that the fate of Tuscany depended not on the will of its rulers, but on the decisions of the great powers, France, Austria, and Spain. Gian-Gaston de' Medici, the last Grand Duke of the dynasty, ruled from 1723 to 1737. His reign was overshadowed by the absence of direct male heirs, which meant the inevitable end of the dynasty. Gian-Gaston suffered from alcoholism and took virtually no part in public affairs, leaving the administration to regents and advisors. The personal life of the last Medici was tragic. His marriage to Anna Maria Francesca of Saxe-Lauenburg was unhappy. The couple lived separately, and they had no children. Gian-Gaston spent his time in the company of young favorites, which caused scandals at court and undermined the authority of the dynasty. Contemporaries described him as a degenerate ruler who had lost interest in public affairs. Gian-Gaston's death in 1737 marked the end of the male line of the Medici dynasty. According to international agreements, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was to pass to representatives of the House of Lorraine, related to the Austrian Habsburgs. This decision was made by the great powers without taking into account the opinion of the Tuscan nobility or the people. The last representative of the dynasty was Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Gian-Gastone's sister, who received the title of Electress of the Palatinate through her marriage. She outlived her brother by several years and played an important role in preserving the family's cultural heritage. According to her will, all the Medici art collections were to remain in Florence forever and be accessible to the public. Anna Maria Luisa's will was the last great act of the Medici dynasty. Thanks to her foresight, Florentine museums have preserved a unique collection of works of art assembled by the family over 4 centuries of rule. This gift to humanity was a fitting conclusion to the history of a family that changed the face of European civilization. The legacy of the Medici dynasty in European history cannot be overestimated. Over 4 centuries, this family of Florentine bankers and rulers fundamentally changed the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the continent. From modest money changers in the 13th century to the great dukes of Tuscany in the 18th century, the Medici family followed a path that became a model for understanding the mechanisms of power and influence in the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era. The Medici's economic legacy laid the foundations for the modern banking system. Their innovations in international payments, branch systems, risk management principles, and accounting methods became the standard for financial institutions in subsequent eras. The Medici Bank can be considered the first international financial corporation in human history, anticipating the development of the global economy by several centuries. The family's influence on the Catholic Church was no less significant. 4 popes from the Medici family, Leo X, Clement VII, Pius IV, and Leo XIII, ruled the Holy See during critical periods in church history. Their pontificates coincided with the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation, when the main directions of Catholicism's development for centuries to come were determined. The trade in indulgences, which reached unprecedented proportions under the Medici popes, was one of the factors that provoked the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther directed his famous 95 Theses precisely against the practices that flourished under Leo X. Thus, the Medici unwittingly became the catalysts of a religious revolution that split Western Christianity. The cultural heritage of the dynasty remains one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. The Medici were patrons of the arts throughout their history, supporting the work of Donatello, Botticelli, Michelangelo, Raphael, and hundreds of other artists, sculptors, architects, and thinkers. Without their patronage, the Italian Renaissance might have taken a completely different form, or not happened at all. Under the Medici, Florence became a laboratory for a new European culture. The Platonic Academy, founded under their patronage, revived interest in ancient philosophy. The Laurentian Library preserved thousands of ancient manuscripts for posterity. Architectural projects financed by the family changed the face of not only Florence, but also other European cities. The Medici's political methods also had a long-term impact on the development of European statehood. Their understanding of the role of money in politics, the art of diplomacy, and the principles of governing subjects through a system of patronage and patronage became a model for many rulers of subsequent eras. Niccolò Machiavelli, in creating his political philosophy, drew heavily on his observations of the Medici's methods of government. The Medici dynasty's marriages linked them to the major royal houses of Europe. Maria de' Medici, who became Queen of France, brought Italian cultural traditions to the French court. Other members of the family married German princes, Polish magnates, and Spanish grandees, spreading the family's influence across the continent. The art collections assembled by the Medici became the foundation of the world's largest museums. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the Louvre in Paris, and many other museum collections owe their existence to the dynasty's art policy. The will of the last representative of the family, according to which the collections should remain public property forever, became one of the first acts of museum legislation in history. Finally, the history of the Medici dynasty itself has become an important source for understanding the mechanisms of historical development. Their rise and fall demonstrate how economic power transforms into political influence, how wealth can buy power but cannot guarantee its longevity. The history of the Medici is a textbook of European civilization written by the lives of real people.